Thank you, and a warm welcome to Debatt i Lund here at Grand in Lund, and also a warm welcome to the audience watching at home. My name is Karin Arbsjö. I'm a journalist at Sveriges Radio. And Debatt i Lund is a place for conversation and intellectual discussions in collaboration between Lund University, the Faculty of Social Sciences, and Sydsvenskan, who are broadcasting live. It is now 3 weeks and 1 day before America votes, and the race between the two presidential candidates is extremely tight, according to the polls. It's been a dramatic election campaign with the two assassination attempts on former President Trump, with President Biden dropping out of the re-election bid in July and swiftly being replaced by Vice President Kamala Harris at top of the Democratic ticket. And it is an election in dramatic times with the expanding bloodshed in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, and hurricanes ravaging the US. And tonight, of course, we will try to predict the outcome of the presidential election, even though it seems totally impossible. But more importantly, we will try to understand a bit more about what motivates the American voters, and we will focus on the young, the people who are the future of the country. What makes Gen Z go to the polls? How do the 8 million potential teenage first-time voters make their choice? How can we understand the political polarization dividing the US, and what's missing from the media coverage? Now it's an honor for me to introduce the evening's panel. Sanna Thorén Bjärling, journalist at Dagens Nyheter, former US correspondent, and author of several books on the US. Welcome.
Thank you.
Michael Busetta, a political scientist here at Lund University, specializing in the impact of social media on politics. Welcome. Aaron James Goldman, also from Lund University. You're a researcher in religious studies, specializing in Christianity, nationalism, and conspiracy theories. Welcome. And then we have Rakel Shukri, cultural journalist at Sydsvenskan with a long-standing interest in American politics. Welcome. Now I would like to start with just a quick poll to get to know the panel. Who is an American citizen? Good. And who has been to the US during the past 3 months? And who got married in Memphis?
Heyo.
Yeah. So now you know a bit more about our panel. The youngest people eligible to vote in this election, they were only 10 years old when Donald Trump came down that golden escalator and announced he was running for president. During their middle and high school years, they have experienced the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movements. They lived through COVID. They've seen a president claim the election was stolen and the Capitol being attacked. So with that background, who are the so-called Gen Z? And by that, you usually mean the people between roughly 12 and 27. Who are they when it comes to politics? Are they driven and motivated, or are they more disillusioned and cynical? What do you say, Sanna?
Well, that's a huge question, of course. I think they're all of the above, probably. Of course, it's 41 million voters, and as you said, I think 8 million of them are first-time voters. And that means they are representing about 20% of the electorate. I think last time they voted around 55% of them voted. So they have a lower voter turnout than the older generations. That's probably important here. I think we see some of them are very driven by single issues like the economy or the debts and the inflation and things that are close to them, probably a lot of domestic issues. I think for some people, other singular issues are extremely important, like the Middle East and reproductive rights. So I think you will see all sorts. But of course, there are some things that are special with them. I think some of the things that I've found interesting when I've kind of looked into some studies is that they are only about a third of the Gen Z voters think that America should have a big and important role on the global stage. That's a much smaller number than, for example, the Boomers or the Gen X, and they're also more prone to accepting political violence than older generations, which I also think is important to know.
Where do you think that is the part about the role being played in the world?
I think the older you can tell that the older a person is, the more important they think, or the more natural they think it is that the United States does play a role on the global scene. I think some of that has to do with the history and the memories from the Second World War, and that kind of the historical role that the United States has played. I think the younger generations might seem more disillusioned with the role that the U.S. has played on the global stage, and also I think they see that many of them see the big problems that they have at home, and they think that they should deal with that first. So I think it's a mix, but I think it's interesting. It's not always what you think.
What do you think we tend to get wrong when we think about young voters, Aaron?
I mean, we as in, what do Swedish people
all
get
of us
wrong?
here
Or
in
all
this
of us
room.
in this, okay, perfect. So I think that there's a sense in which we might think that young people are excited, they're riveted, they're ready to go to the polls, they're paying a lot of attention. But I think then we forget a couple of factors. One is, especially among, I would say, men under the age of 30, a number of ways that they encounter the world are through a media landscape heavily moderated essentially by the right wing and right wing adjacent figures. So I'm thinking about various sports avenues, a media landscape that involves video game players, YouTubers, people like Logan Paul and others. There's a way in which they're shaped by a cultural discourse that doesn't have too much competition from the left wing in the US. You see people starting to push in that direction. But I think that that's one thing. And I think that the other is that young people are probably a bit disillusioned. I can speak for myself, possibly in continuity, as it were, with Zoomers, even though I'm, of course, a bit older than that. And I watched an election get stolen in 2000 by the George W. Bush campaign when I was 14, 15 years old, something like that. And so that stays with me, right? I imagine that young people carry similar memories about the last few years.
Mm. Michael Bosetta, from a scientific point of view, how important are generations when it comes to understanding political affiliation?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. And as you were mentioning about history and experiences, the idea of generations from sociology is meant to capture formative experiences. And so if you think about what that means is that what happens during adolescence for you. And so as you were saying about young people being disillusioned in the country, think about growing up as an adolescent in the past 10, 15 years. You've just seen crisis. In Europe, rise of skepticism, Brexit, Trump. They don't have a history before when times were good. When I grew up, and during my formative years, there was the Gulf War. Yeah. America rolled in and ended it in 2 days. You know, it was like, wow, America's a superpower. Gen Z doesn't have that experience in the same way. But what's kind of interesting, and I have to put this out there, is that these labels, Gen Z, boomers, millennials, these are not scientific concepts. There is no real science behind the idea that Generation Z starts at 1996. We can't prove that. We can't measure that. And so these labels are one way that scientists try to categorize voters in surveys and try to look at change over time, but they don't actually explain things. Gen Z Nest doesn't explain why people vote Democrat relative to their race, class, religion, more important factors. So to answer your question briefly, generations are a category that scientists use to try to chart changes in opinions, but the scientific underpinning of generations, it's really just a label. And so major scientific academies have come out and said we should stop using these categories because the science behind them is frankly not there.
Having said that, we will try to dig a bit deeper into the different categories that you mentioned. But you study social media and politics. What do we know about where young voters get their news and their political information?
Yeah, I mean, this changes year to year with different surveys about what percentage of Americans are getting their news on TikTok versus Facebook or what have you. I think the most important difference between younger and older citizens is the diversity of their news diet. So young people are getting news from various platforms in very short form video that is not very high quality. And in media and communication, we call that media snacking, right? It's like getting junk food. You're eating a lot of bad news all the time. And what we can find in the research is that this media snacking makes people feel that they're informed because they're getting news from different sources all the time. But if you actually measure their political knowledge, it's low. So people think they understand politics, but if you actually measure it by classic measures, they're not as smart as they think they are. And they also believe that algorithms will serve news to them. It's called the news find me perception, that I don't have to look for news because it's going to find me. And I think over time, we'll see that start to have corrosive effects on an informed citizenry.
Can I ask real quick a
Sure,
question
go
to you?
ahead.
So how, because we're talking about short form media, YouTube videos, TikToks, et cetera, I take it. But people in my parents' generation are also fixated on cable news, which, even if not short form, seems designed to entertain in a very particular way that, at least on my appraisal, is totally toxic. So how do you assess the relative value or educatability? I don't know exactly how to frame it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to be clear, of course, you can watch a YouTuber that is very informative and gives you high quality news. So it's really more about the diversity, that you're getting it from so many different sources in bite-sized forms that it's like eating a bag of goodies, right? You feel like, oh, this is, I feel satisfied, but it's actually not nutritious for your civic health. So it's the diversity, not so much whether it's long or short. I should.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I know you've also been looking at how politics and campaigns use social media, and for a while in this election, it looked like the young voters were going to have to choose between two 8-year-olds. When Kamala Harris replaced President Biden on the ticket, there was a notable turn in the Democratic campaign towards memes targeting the younger generation, like adopting the brat summer aesthetic, for instance. And this in turn prompted headlines about the memification of politics. How important are the memes, would you say? Or would you agree that there is a memification of politics? Rakel?
I would say that it's very important for the younger voters, but it's also a result of them being cynical. And I know that, Sanna, you said that Gen Z are both disillusioned, motivated, and cynical at the same time. And I think there's a huge population that view politics also as some kind of entertainment. It's for fun, because they don't have any hope in the two democratic parties anymore. They know that there are huge problems, and I don't think that they believe that either Trump or Kamala are going to solve those problems. So the election becomes some kind of like irony competition. And I read some interviews with some youngsters who support Kamala Harris because they don't like Trump. But the memes that they were spreading about her were like the goofy things that she has said. And one of the young supporters even said that, well, she's goofy, she's almost like a wine aunt, you know, an aunt that drinks too much wine too early in the day. So I think that is important for them, but it also makes me kind of sad that the youngsters don't have so much hope. So it's more of a competition in who can make the most twisted memes in a way.
Do the memes actually have a political impact, Michael?
It's hard to measure. I think one thing that's interesting about memes is it's a good example of bottom-up digital activism. Going back to Bernie Sanders had the dank meme stash, it was as a Facebook group, and what it allows do, because you're right, Sanna, that younger voters don't turn out to the same, they don't vote. But what they do is they engage in alternative forms of activism, and memes are a good example of that. So you'll have online communities that make a lot of memes. You also see this with the far right as well. And this is a way for them to express their politics without going through the formal mechanisms like voting and institutions which they tend to distrust. So I think it's an interesting example of political activism and expression more than it is changing the political landscape.
Do you mind if I? Oh, please
What
go
do you
ahead.
say, Sanna?
No, but just that I also don't think that the young people, of course, they're not stupid. They also know that some of the things that they see and read are not true. I mean, it's the same with adults, that they totally know that they use an isolated part of the whole media landscape. But I talked to this 17-year-old at a gas station just outside of Butler in Pennsylvania recently. And I asked him, so as I ask almost everyone, like, where do you get your information? And he mentioned a few far-right kind of YouTube channels and whatever. He used the word far-right himself. He kind of said that, well, I usually go to the far-right, whatever. And I asked him, so there are a lot of conspiracy theories going around. So how do you know what to believe? How do you tell which is a conspiracy theory and what is kind of truth? And he kind of smiled and he said, well, you know, I use my gut feeling. And I said, well, so I believe most things, but if it seems very kind of off, I don't believe it. And then he mentioned as an example some tax policy by Kamala Harris, like no, that can never pay for whatever childcare. But that's kind of answer is pretty disturbing, I think.
Aaron,
If I can, jump in on just a couple of points. To Sanna, I guess I would want to sort of level a tiny challenge to that claim and suggest that the way a lot of us judge whether what we're reading or not is the case is by basically a sort of intuition or gut feeling, and based on networks of established trust and so on. And there's been a broad, I think, lack of trust that's sort of befallen the world in some ways since COVID, since earlier than COVID, and so on. So knowledge authorities are not necessarily trusted to the same degree. We might take issue with that, of course, too. Also, to talk about the memification, I guess I'd like to ask if this indicates that the Democratic Party, in generating some of these memes and aligning themselves with, Charlie XCX and so on, if there's an attempt to sort of get their hands dirty in a different way that they normally haven't been. We can recall Michelle Obama saying, when they go low, we go high. But I think young people, I certainly feel this way about myself, whether or not I count as young, we actually want our political representatives to fight in the dirt for things that we think are important. And so, at least at the beginning, the idea of generating some memes and getting, talking about J.D. Vance and Trump as weird, these things indicate a different type of battle strategy that to me was somewhat attractive as someone aligned with the left in the US.
Interesting. I know, Aaron and Michael, as Americans living in Sweden, a question that you get asked a lot is, how can half of the American people be voting for someone who is a celebrity-turned politician, making outlandish and racist claims and charged in 4 different criminal cases, and that Aaron, you have looked into what voters actually do when they vote for Donald Trump, or what they see in him, or focusing on his background in wrestling.
Yeah, so I'm not an anthropologist, but I am sort of looking at some other journalists' work and trying to figure out what's happening at the nexus of QAnon and Trump supporters and why they seem to be interested in this figure who's making blatantly false claims. And I think the broadest possible thing I can say is that it seems that it's not that people like Donald Trump despite the fact that he seems brutish and strange and mean and lies. They like him because of that. And so, Karin, you mentioned this notion of wrestling that I've brought up. Some of my ongoing research looks at the ways that Trump has deployed wrestling rhetoric, so rhetoric and styles from American professional wrestling. The WWE is the most prominent media company for this. For those that don't know, American professional wrestling is not actually wrestling. It is a sort of athletic theater, right? It's staged and it's incredibly popular in the United States. But the way that people perform in it is that they stay in character and the audience sort of goes along with it, right? And so Trump was involved in this for 30 years as a performer and friend to the former CEO of WWE, Vince McMahon. I could tell a much longer story about this. I've talked enough, so I won't for now. But this type of fictive performance is something that I think Trump didn't bring into politics, but he brought the genre to American electoral politics in a way that suggests that what American electoral politics always was already a type of wrestling, was already a type of disingenuous performance in a certain way. And so this created a sort of exciting climate for people who were already skeptical of the American political landscape. And they wanted to support this grenade tossed into the wrestling ring of American electoral politics.
Raquel?
No, I would say that I think that's one of the reasons. I think that a lot of people that support Trump, they don't care if he lies or not. They feel that he's entertaining, and most of all, they feel that he's strong. There's also a lot of Trump voters who likes that he's a blatant racist, blatant sexist, anti-Semitic, but they feel that he stands up for them because they're like Joe Rogan. They are, and in Elon Musk, they are tired of the woke left, or they feel that the communists or the feminists are gonna like burn up the states. But most of all, I mean, 8 million people who voted for Trump in 2016 voted for Obama. So they're not all racists. And I think somebody here mentioned that the main reason that people do vote for Trump, and I really think that he's going to win this election, is that they don't have any trust at all in the two parties. I think I have traveled through maybe half of the states in the U.S. The despair is huge. If you have been to like opioid suffering cities, it's like a post-apocalyptic society. If you have been to LA or Washington or New York or Seattle, you know that there are hordes of homeless people that nobody takes care of and nobody cares of them. But you also have a working class and a middle class that is suffering because the cost of health, of daycare, of universities is so huge that even if you have two good incomes in a family, it's so difficult to just get by. I read this book by Martin Gelin recently. He's leaving the US. He really loves New York, and now he's leaving because he mentions that when he got a child and he was looking for daycare in New York, do you know how much it cost? $4,000 a month. 40,000 kronor for one child. And then he found a daycare that only cost $2,500 a month. You have people in the States who are being bankrupt if they have a serious disease. You have people running away from ambulances because it's so expensive. And I would say that these, I mean, and let me be a little bit brutish. In a lot of parts of the US, it is a shithole country because the people who are making the least money, who really are struggling, some people have 2 or 3 jobs, they don't see a solution because they know that the Democrats aren't the heroes, because the Democrats are also responsible for the huge divides in the country, that the system is rigged against the poor and the middle class. And I used to be kind of skeptical against Bernie Sanders, but the more I traveled in the US and the more I read about all the things that the media channels in the US never cares about, because the only thing they care about is, oh, Trump is so awful, and Trump said this, and Trump lied about this. Who gives an F what he lies about? Look at the huge problems that people have. And so I think that's one of the reasons that he is going to win the election, because Kamala Harris, when she's saying we're not going back, all right, that's going to attract a lot of people, but where does she want to go? I watched a lot of her rallies. She doesn't have any clear progressive plan for young people that gives hope for a better future. Sorry for getting mad, but
What do you say to this, Michael?
I don't like. I'm very skeptical of Kamala. If you didn't get that,
Yeah,
I can elaborate on that later.
you will
Yeah.
be able to. Yeah.
So I think
Sorry for calling parts of the U.S. a shithole.
it's okay. I agree entirely. That's why I live in Sweden. No, I think the question about how can people vote for Trump, it's not just about Trump. I remember being a student here in Lund in 2012 when it was Obama and Romney. And there's more in the Swedish psyche that Republicans are villains. And this has been there for a long. I know that you think it. Right. It's actually crazy how uniform that thinking is. And I think that oversimplifies the complexities of the United States. And Swedes think, how can people vote for Republicans? They should vote for Democrats and big government because that's what works here in our country, which is a kind of a feeling of moral superiority that completely ignores the complexities of the United States, which, by the way, I could be wrong, but I'm quite sure that it's the most diverse and multicultural polity in the history of civilization. It is so complex and diverse, the United States. So many challenges. And lots of natural resources, but also, for now anyways, the world's preeminent superpower, which is why people are so interested in it. But what Swedes don't understand, I think, in this well-functioning society is not just how bad it is in certain places of the United States, but how government doesn't work in a lot of parts of the United States. Where I'm from, in the southern part, have fun getting a driver's license. Try getting your street fixed. The government will show up, blow it up. I'm thinking maybe one of my friends is watching who's been dealing with this for 2 years. He can't drive close to his house because his street is just filled with potholes because the city government came to fix it but never came back. And it's these types of things that Republicans play on, saying, you want to put more of your tax dollars to that? Let private enterprise solve it. Let people who can shoot rockets into space and land back on the platform fix your streets. That's what Republican voters are thinking about. And the messenger for that right now is Donald Trump. But there's many Republicans who vote Republican because they don't like the way that government works. It's ineffective. So that's maybe your 8 million who aren't racist. We've learned that not all Trump voters are racist, and wrestling is fake.
Yeah. But do you mind if I add something to this?
Go ahead.
For again, not particularly offended that you call the U.S. a shithole. It's okay.
I'm from Malmö. It's very despised in large parts of the country. Yeah.
You know, I find that Malmö feels really, in nice ways, quite familiar. There's a certain.
You're from Chicago.
Yeah. Well, there's like a friendly shabbiness to the place that when I see a small group of
we have
rats.
the crime also.
Sure.
Yeah.
But you wave to the rats in public, and it reminds me of home. But I guess like what I wanted to point out is that I think you and I may have a slight difference of opinion on Republicans. I don't have a problem with Republican voters per se, but I do think Republican politicians mean ill for the world in a different kind of way than most Democratic politicians do. So I do think that they're close to being vampires and not worth negotiating with. I think that, no, in sincerity, I think that the way that political opposition needs to understand them in office is that they aren't a good faith party interested in the well-being who have a different philosophy, though many people who vote Republican, I would go so far as to say I am interested to speak with and think that a leftist progressive agenda might even attract.
I agree with that statement in the more recent Republican Party. I think that's what the effect of Trumpism has done, has turned that rhetoric up to intolerable discourse. But I still just...
Even like Mitch McConnell, I mean, all these people are architects of doom.
But yes, and again, I'm not like hardcore Republican defending the Republican Party, right?
No.
But I'm just thinking about Mitt Romney. The guy's a Mormon. How evil is he? You know?
Let's leave the discussion about exactly how evil you consider
I don't know. It's
fair enough.
to
get
be.
into the. I am in theology department. We could talk about it.
One thing that has grown a lot in the U.S. Is the polarization when it comes to negative partisanship. How negative you think it is that someone votes for the other party? Sanna, one of your books is a lot about polarization. Tell me a little bit about.
Well, I think it's so interesting to hear, because also from you Americans, because I recognize so much of it. But first of all, I think I think a lot of Swedes believe that Swedes and Americans are so much alike, and I think there are so many deep differences between Sweden and the United States. Like on the surface, there's so many similarities, but I think when Swedes think that they can understand or should be able to understand how Americans vote or think, I think they sometimes think that they could identify with them on a deeper level, and I think there is a very kind of deep differences. I think the relationship between the individual and the government and the state is fundamentally different. But in terms of the polarization, I think it comes, as you talked about, both. It's been a slow and long process that has become. It's gone faster the past couple of decades, but it really started a long time ago. And what is now the big political parties have become more like identities, I think. And when you look back, of course, the U.S. has been very polarized before. I mean, we had the Civil War, and then during the Civil Rights movement and the Vietnam War, but they were still kind of political issues. Now it's more identity-based, and it very much revolves around the parties. And if you look at the Republican Party, it's drifted very much to the right. The Democrats have drifted to the left, but not as much. And I think what you talked about, Aaron, also about the Republican Party becoming evil, I think it has to do with what is the Republican Party right now. It's, if you kind of simplify it a bit, it's white Christian Americans who do not live in the urban areas, and the Democratic Party is all the rest. And so, of course, Republicans and then the complicated kind of electoral system, political system, exaggerates the polarization. So you get more extreme candidates on top of the ticket, so you get more extreme politics than the electorate is. So the politicians, you can see on the abortion issue, for example, which turned out to be much more extreme than people wanted it to be, and we see that all across. But I also think that that's also when we see that the Republicans that have power, they realize that their base is too small demographically to win elections. So in the choice between democracy and power, they choose power, and then you have to suppress the other part's votes. And I think that, but a lot of people aren't aware of that, I think. So you kind of have both at the same time.
Can I just disagree with something? Sanna, did you say that the Republicans have gone to the right and the Democrats have gone to the left?
But the Republicans have gone much further to the right
Yeah.
than parts of the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party is so big.
Yeah.
It's so large. And
But-
now you
but
have
has it-
everything from...
Has it really drifted more to the left? I mean, if you look at the Democratic Party a couple of decades ago, when it was a party for the working class, you had a lot of union people who were active in the party. When Obama came in, a lot of people said that it turned into a party for the highly educated. And also, I mean, if you look at Bill Clinton, how it's the economy stupid, but he also, like Tony Blair, drifted the party a lot to the right. And if you see at all the progressive candidates that they have had, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, I mean, they have all been, nobody has won any primary elections. They don't want to have any radical politics in the
No, you're
Democrats.
right.
And in
So for us,
2020
it's not...
In 2020, if I can add to that,
Yeah.
Sanders was systematically, Obama organized
Yeah.
a sort of
Yeah.
last-minute rejection of Sanders through the series of other challengers
Yeah.
after the early primaries. I'm sorry for...
No, but you're
and
right,
and
absolutely.
my point is that if you look at young people, they really have a taste for progressive politics. They do want to change the healthcare system in the US, a lot of them. I mean, and have a system that is closer to the European system, where you don't have to cut off an arm and a leg to be able to have Social Security. But the Democratic Party I mean, Joe Biden has done some progressive things. But I mean, they are right of the Moderaterna, Sverigedemokraterna. They would really need some socialism or social democracy in there, but they're not
And I
left driven.
No, and I think that a lot of I mean, young people or older people, they see that as you said before, that Congress or that the government doesn't deliver anything to them. That's also, I think, but you can totally understand why they're frustrated and angry and upset, because they totally see that this doesn't work. And they are stuck in a political system. I think that's what we can see from left to right. Most people I talk to, at least, I don't know with you, but agrees on one thing, and that is that the big divisions are bad for the country and for their relationships. They don't want the big divisions. And do you think
Just
so?
to say that from survey data, I mean, Americans are divided on almost every single issue because of these identity politics. The one thing that they unite on at almost 95% is that all of Congress should be fired immediately.
Right.
There's bipartisan consensus on that.
Yes.
For good reason.
But it's so hard to change, though, the whole system. It's hard. Many people, I think, ask for a multi-party system or get rid of the electoral system or a lot of other changes that are very hard to put through.
Could I make a real quick note? I wonder if we could distinguish also between social issues and economic policy. And I'm not an expert on economic policy, but to me the idea of like the New Deal would be utterly unheard of in today's Democratic Party, for sure. But, of course, over time, the Democratic Party has moved left on certain environmental policies, as well as on social issues, which we can all acknowledge may happen slower than at least I wish it would. So I feel like we could distinguish between those two.
Yes, good point. As you already mentioned, when you ask young people what's their most important political issue, according to the Harvard Youth Poll, American citizens between 18 and 29 years old, they identified inflation, healthcare, and housing as the most critical issues facing the United States. So, as you have been saying, the economy. Do you think this has been reflected in the campaigns so far?
I think the things that Kamala Harris is proposing talks to those issues, but she really only scrapes the surface. I think she has said that she wanted to give 25,000 in down payment if you buy your first house. A lot of economists have said that this is only going to raise the price of houses with $25,000. She has also said that she wanted to lower the cost of some prescription medicine. But I think young people don't buy this. They just feel that it's too little. And I know that in the primary in 2019, at first she was flirting with the idea of removing private health insurance companies from the healthcare system, but then she just flip-flopped again. Because, I mean, if you look at Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, they really want to remake the healthcare system in the US because it's so expensive. It's not a coincidence that a lot of American movies are about people kidnapping somebody or robbing a place just to get money for maybe their daughter is sick or something. But I think she would have needed a more radical progressive politics. And the thing that Trump is probably going to win on is that he doesn't have any solutions. I mean, he promised that he would make healthcare cheaper for everybody. And then he didn't have a plan. What did he say? I have a
Concept of a plan.
I have a concept of a plan. But what people remember is that inflation was lower during Trump and they had more money in their pocket. And I think that's the reason that a lot of young black men are voting for Trump, for instance.
Yeah, I'll just add on economic issues. I mean, the candidates are not that far apart because Harris has had to moderate. She was quite extreme in 2019 and didn't make it very far in that election. But what I find interesting is that this is like more than I've seen in previous presidential elections. This is the election of just freebies, trying to give as much freebies out to voters that you really need. So both candidates agree that they should eliminate tax on tips because there's a lot of service industry work in the battleground states. Giving out money for people to buy their first house, which economists don't know how that would affect the housing market. Trump came out interestingly the other day to say that he would abolish double taxation on Americans living abroad, because who votes highly Democratic? Americans living abroad. So, and you know, it is such a hassle.
I mean, I have to pay someone every year to figure out my tax situation, but I also will never make enough to have to be double taxed. And
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
So that won't help me.
But still trying to do it. I was like trying to do my taxes last year. I was like, I have a PhD and I can't figure this out. I'm like on irs.gov.
Yeah.
But it's a smart play. When I heard that, I was like, oh, that would be great. Should I vote for Trump? You know, because he's appealing to overseas voters. And so there's these targeted policies to just like, here's some money. And no one knows how we're going to pay for it when the country's $35 trillion in debt.
But it's so emotional. I mean, like you said, they talk about the inflation and they say what they see is when they go to the grocery store and things are still more expensive now than they used to be. They see maybe reporting that inflation is down, but that doesn't tell them anything. Mm-hmm. They still have less money now than they had during the Trump administration.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what counts. And I think it's so it's an emotional thing. People don't go study their taxes. Of course they see when they can't afford medicine or other things, but I also think that it's not as rational as we sometimes think.
One thing I thought about is that Kamala Harris, she's so cautious. She's the only thing that she isn't soft on is abortion. She really speaks from her heart. But I mean, she stole some of Trump's budskap, messages, like no tips on no tax on tips. That's hard to say. But she's so cautious that she doesn't even want to talk that much about her being black, for instance. Like when Trump said, I don't know if she's black. I mean, she was Indian before and then she turned black. I mean, she just said, next question. And that really worries me, that her economical suggestions are very, very mild. They're not close to anything progressive. And she's also very afraid of turning away white voters. So, I mean, she talks about her mother sometimes, she worked at McDonald's, but she never really touches the race issue that much. She doesn't want to be perceived as a black woman. She doesn't even talk about that much that she is a woman. And I think that makes her vague for a lot of young voters who deem these issues important. Do you want to rip,
I've had
rip
some
a
thoughts,
shirt?
but no. No, I don't have a big Kamala Harris shirt on under this. But I guess I wonder if that's a conscious strategy to sort of let one's appearance do some of the talking, as it were, without attempting to alienate people who will be put off by this constellation of identities. I have no idea, though. That's totally speculative. It might be residual fear from the Clinton campaign in 2016 against Trump. I don't know.
But Obama didn't talk a lot about race in his first campaign either.
No, I mean, but you can do a lot without explicitly saying, "Hey, you know, I'm of this identity category. I'm of this group." You can use it in various ways.
But I think a lot of people wonder, is America ready for a non-white woman as president?
They've had an orange man, so sorry.
Well,
That was cheap. That was
You,
cheap.
Raquel, you mentioned the abortion issue, and this is certainly a gendered election. Americans are much more likely to believe that Kamala Harris would make things better for women and that Donald Trump would make things better for men. And political affiliation is even more gendered among the young than in the population as a whole. Why do you think that is? How can we understand this gender gap in politics?
I think this is it's the first big, I mean, of course, the midterms in 2022 was the first election after the Dobbs decision, that after the abortion, the right to abortion was abolished. I think that is still a big issue, but that is also a big issue for many men, even if it's more among women. It's not an issue where the polling is very different between men and women. It energizes perhaps more women, but it's the opinions aren't that different. But I think that it's probably part of it. And yeah.
I would say, I mean, that's a crucial factor,
Yes.
right? One of the more important maybe things that could actually have tangible effects in, you know, who wins, appoints more judges to all these courts, et cetera. But in terms of gender, I do think the Trump phenomenon does kind of still represent a certain type of masculine reaction to the successes of feminism in the West and in the United States over the past, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years or something like that. I also think it's interesting to point out that Donald Trump doesn't actually appear as a traditional masculine man. He's not Ronald Reagan. He's not even Joe Camel. Like, he's a strange figure. And it's interesting that around him has coalesced a certain vision of masculinity in support of him, even as it turns to figures in the alt-right media, people like Andrew Tate and other manosphere people who are gross, that does not look like Donald Trump at all, right? So there's this strange constellation of gender issues at work here that I think we've only just begun to tap the surface of as researchers.
But I don't agree. I think that I can understand why a lot of the voters perceive him as strong, because he never shies away from any questions, any interviews, any situations.
He got shot and stood up and said, "Fight." I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
Well,
And then on the other hand, wait, Aaron.
Sure, go
Wait.
ahead, go
Yeah.
ahead.
And then on the other hand, you have Kamala Harris. You know, for 3 years, she is the vice president. The running joke for 3 years was, where is Kamala? where is Kamala? Where is Kamala? Because she got afraid of the journalists. She did some bad interviews. She said some gaffes. People perceived that she was weak on the gränsen, the border. Sorry, and then she shun away. And she hid away from the journalist, and then she reshaped herself and was reborn as this presidential candidate. I think she's had a lot of good teachers who has taught her some good slogans, like don't say we can be unburdened by what has been, and stupid things like that. But her problem is that she still seems weak. I mean, how many interviews has she done? She has done maybe 3 or 4 major channel interviews in the last couple of days because she believes that her rallies is going to win the voters over. But Trump is everywhere. But she has done like 4 major interviews. She doesn't seem strong.
Do you mind if I just, I know
Yeah.
I've been talking a lot.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk too much more, but I'm not a super big Kamala fan by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I hope she wins, but
Me too.
yeah. But I think some of these issues are not necessarily only her as a candidate, though I follow you. I think it's also that the Democratic Party is in kind of a bind because many of its special interests and donors want policies that are the exact opposite of what the voting base wants or some major compromise thereof, right? And so what it means to be a successful candidate for the Democratic Party is to resist giving people the red meat that the Republicans can give all the time because the party itself, the base has in some ways disciplined and taught the party apparatus in a certain way, or they've adapted to the base, whereas the Democratic Party politicians seem to always want to sort of reshape the voters and blame them for things, right? So she's in this machine.
Sanna?
No, but I think talking about Kamala Harris, I also see her weaknesses. I know people who say even this year who have voted Democrat for a long time, they say, no, I'm not voting at all this year. And their friends go, why? Oh, you have to vote this year, you have to vote. And they say, no, I don't like either candidate. I don't even like Kamala Harris. I don't trust her. But I think that as a vice president, vice presidents rarely have this big profile. It's hard for them. And I think especially for her, from the very beginning, everybody would see her as, like, you have to follow your boss, of course. You have to abide by his policies and do whatever he tells you to do. And also, I think many people, at least in the first year, they thought that Biden would be a one-term president. And so if she just made one step aside, everybody would look to her and say, wow, she's trying to make her own, kind of creating her own platform. And she was very, I think, careful not doing that. And also, I think Biden didn't give her issues or areas where she could thrive. He gave her pretty tough areas. I don't think that, what I hear is that he didn't really made her his kind of
Wing woman.
yeah, no, well, yeah, so she had a tough time. And also I think she was also stuck to some degree in Washington because she had to vote in the Senate. She had to be in Washington because of because there was a tie in the Senate. So I do think it's a little bit unfair to kind of just take all the criticism she had as vice president. I think some of it is probably true. I totally think that she should do all the interviews, but I say that as a reporter. I think everybody should be there all the time for journalists, of course. So I think that's a mistake. They will come back to her and she will look weak because she doesn't seem as she dares taking questions off the cuff.
Yeah,
Short.
I don't think she looks weak. She's a prosecutor. I think she looks very tough. The problem is she hasn't gone through the year process to become the nominee. And that's, Americans put their candidates through the hardest job interview in the world. And she didn't go through that, but she was the vice president. She should already have that name recognition. We should know who she is and what she stands for. And Americans simply don't, and she's not going out and doing it. And I think that's going to hurt her big time.
Now, Kamala Harris has been notably less dramatic in her rhetoric about Donald Trump as a threat to democracy than Biden was. But seeing as how Trump opposed the election result last time, and the attack on the Capitol and his statements on violence, etc., do you think a lot of young people consider this an election where democracy is on the ballot?
Well, you see that the young people are, for them, democracy is not as important as for the older generations. If you look at what they say about political violence, for example, I think, what is it, like only 44% of the Gen Zs reject all political violence. And I think 9 out of 10 of the boomers and the Gen Xs say no to political violence. And I think that's a pretty stunning kind of number. And I think there's some other number with like 56% of the Gen Zs say that political violence against some elected officials could be okay, which is also a pretty high number. And some are, I think, very energized about the democracy issue, and others are not, or see it in a different way.
I mean, this is the place that I feel like I need to passionately remind all of us that the election, there was a coup in 2000, right? In the year 2000, where there were protests top down by Republican operatives called the Brooks Brothers Riot. Am I getting that right? Brooks? Something like that. I could be getting the name wrong. But we're protesting counting facilities before the deadline. Effectively, that presidential election, which resulted in the Bush presidency and all the atrocities committed in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, came about due to a certain type of non-democratic process, right? So I don't blame anybody for doubting it. Now, on top of that, with the Electoral College and with the nomination process for presidential candidates, certainly, the number of steps between my vote and actually the expression of democratic will is so many that it really feels like my vote isn't necessarily worth the paper that I have to print it on and mail back to the US. I don't think it gets counted, and I'm not sure that it would matter anyway, because it's in the state of Illinois, which for sure will go for Harris.
Rakel?
I think that there are a lot of young people who feel that democracy has been on the ballot several elections in the US. I mean, if you, not everywhere, but there are parts of the country where racism has been rampant for decades and still is. But I think for the young radical generation that have been protesting against the war in the US on student campuses, they feel that they are tired of the US being a war machine, because despite Joe Biden having said that he wants Netanyahu to cool down the war, to reach I can't find the words today, ceasefire. The US is still exporting a lot of weapons to Israel, and they called Biden Genocide Joe, and Kamala Harris, her position on Israel isn't that, it's almost identical to Joe Biden's. So I think a lot of Arab Americans and radical young people in the US are sick and tired of the Democrats, because they know that Obama was a war king. He was called the drone king, and they're sick and tired of these wars. And I don't think that they see that Trump is a bigger threat against the world of the US than the Democrats have been under Genocide Joe, their word.
Thank you. So we're almost done. We have just seconds left. So I just want to end by asking you, who do you think, who will become the next president? Quickly.
I will not bet on this one. I'm a reporter, so I ask the question.
Michael.
I think Harris is running a stronger ground game in Pennsylvania, and that might flip it.
Yeah, Harris takes Pennsylvania. I worry Trump takes both Michigan and Wisconsin, and then it's no good for her.
Rakel.
I think he's going to win, but I'm with her.
Thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Sanna Thorén Björling, Michael Posetta, Aaron Goldman, and Rakel Shukri. Thank you.